Welcome back to the Galileo Ventures Podcast and Happy New Year. Kicking off our first episode of 25, we're diving into all things mergers and acquisitions. We cover the latest M&A changes, the state of M&A activity in Australia, and tips for founders when getting acquired or buying competitors. This conversation was recorded end of 2024, just before the new M&A reforms were passed in Parliament, with our resident experts Toby and Claire, partners at Herbert Smith Freehills. Galileo Season 2 pod is proudly sponsored by HSF, and we're glad to have them back on the show. Let's dive in. Welcome back. We wanted to dive into something on the lips of everyone, both our limited partners, investors, as well as our founders, which is mergers and acquisitions. In particular, what is happening with M&A in Australia? We've heard there's a lot of changes coming through. We've heard that the government doesn't like it anymore, and we've heard that startups are all screwed. Can you give us a bit of insight into what is happening right now in M&A?
Yeah, so there have been some reforms proposed to the competition approvals that will basically see mergers get a little bit harder to do. Essentially, there are going to be much lower thresholds for when ACCC approval of mergers is required, and it's going to most likely result in increased times to closing, maybe increased scrutiny as well, and a number of transactions that you might not necessarily expect to be caught may well be caught. Why is this relevant? Well, it's relevant because, as James suggests, are startups screwed if they can't exit? Well, maybe they are, but we think that there's still plenty of hope. We think deals will be able to achieve, but it might just require a bit more thoughtful planning to make it happen.
Okay. And what's the impetus for these changes? Why is the Australian government clamping down on mergers right now?
Essentially, the ACCC is concerned that there were a number of transactions that were going through without its review at all. In particular, where you might have, in the tech sector specifically, where you might have, a large global transaction that doesn't have a huge connection to Australia, the ACCC wouldn't have seen that transaction at all necessarily, whereas now under the revised thresholds, it probably would. And so they think it's important that they have a voice at the table as part of the global, regulatory community.
Do you think this is necessarily something that they're taking a lead from another jurisdiction, or do you think this is very much something that's internally led because of some of the constraints we have in Australia?
I would say a couple of things. The first is ACCC hasn't won a merger acquisition case where they've taken it to court for a number of years. And so they have been pushing since when Rod Sims was commissioner for the laws to be amended, so it will be easier for them to stop. The second is there's obviously Labor government and the competition minister, big fans of Lena Carr and her approach, which, so he certainly has met her and has talked up her profile on his Twitter feed. I mean, there's obviously been a general reaction and long-going inquiry into the digital platforms, and so there is a painting that they're too powerful. So the example always is Facebook's acquisition of Instagram should have been blocked, whether that's right or wrong, but it certainly would come across our desks. And just on Claire's point about international deals coming across and being viewed by ACCC, one of the interesting things was when Google went to buy Fitbit, it was looked at by the ACCC, but it got US approval and EU and UK approval, and the ACCC was not happy with the undertakings and was pushing for further. The parties just completed the deal irrespective, and I don't think that was particularly well taken. But that's some of my view from the outside.
Sounds like geopolitical, M&A level issues. That the reality is a lot of these big deals end up that way. I'm curious on Toby and Claire's experience here of what that local M&A market looks like. Sort of putting aside, I guess, the US tech giants and things like that. We obviously do have, like realestate.com.au is obviously looking at that large UK deal that's currently in the press as we go to the podcast now. But we do have a number of large local companies.
Dominated.
There's Seek, there's
There's obviously
Atlassian's a dominating one.
Canva at least has started to acquire things, so Leonardo being the most recent largest one, but certainly seem to be much more on that sort of acquisition spree compared to what they have been historically, perhaps hypothetically running towards an IPO again. One could say the same about the 300% price increase that's just rolled out. But, what are your thoughts and experiences on that local market? And even, I guess, also, the segments that founders don't think about, of things like PE and things like that, where there are a lot of PE firms in Australia that it feels they're now starting to look much more into the tech sector than perhaps just childcare roll-ups, which seems to have been what they've done historically in the past. And, are you starting to see those signs of more activity within those spaces, I guess, on a domestic focus? Or are you still seeing a lot of that M&A activity being sort of, I guess, offshore to onshore?
No, I mean, there's plenty of M&A activity in Australia, and I think there always has been. I think you are spot on here. A big area where we're seeing a significant number of deals is from, the advent of private capital. So whether that is PE, whether that is, more like crossover investors, we're definitely seeing those as being a very active source of transactions in Australia, especially in the mid-market. There are a number of mid-market PE funds in Australia who have a big focus on technology, and a number of later stage funds as well. So that's definitely an area where we see significant volume.
Yeah, the other driver, as you guys would be aware, is ESV-CLPs have a legislated shelf life of 15 years. Generally, it's 10 with options to extend, but you've got to basically get, wind it up within a very set period of time. The early ESV-CLPs that sort of came through in that Web 2.0 era are certainly coming to the end of their life. There's, I think, as we discussed before, sort of companies that are sitting on there that are potentially in that not quite big enough to IPO, but they're steady businesses. What is going to be done with those companies and how they get those companies out of the ESV-CLP, whether it's merging with other companies in their portfolio or private equity as a buyer.
Definitely. I mean, we've even seen, obviously, at the very pointy end, we saw the secondary transactions out of Blackbird Fund 1, into a number of their institutional or the subsequent institutional shareholders, that I think had happened for a similar reason in, needing to wrap up or certainly start to take the process of wrapping up those funds and deliver some liquidity to investors.
Yeah, there was an article yesterday on continuation funds and the struggle that venture has in setting up or getting approval from their LPs for setting up continuation funds, particularly if
I
it's
didn't see that.
just a
I could imagine. Yeah, I could imagine.
And it's very different to the American approach.
Well, I don't think so at all. Like when I talk to my American colleagues, while people say they love the idea of evergreen, they love the idea of, holding these stars forever, the LPs don't like it. They don't want it.
Yeah, but I also think in the US there's a lot more activity in terms of the crossover funds and things like that are very tech focused, so that you can even within the same house, I guess, and you have more of the sort of large scale, Sequoias and the like that have sort of those different vehicles for different stages that we haven't yet had that degree here.
I think for most VCs and most LPs, the idea that you have an investment last for 100 years is silly. And I think as the interest rates stay like this or change, that's going to continue on. But having said that, the secondary market seems to be maturing a lot. So I think it's going to be really interesting for me to see if that in Australia picks up to a much bigger degree, whether it's buying out LPs, which there's a lot more maturity in the US around that. There's not much here for VC funds, or whether it's buying out founders and secondaries, which again, we're seeing some activity, but not a lot. I think that's a lot of opportunity there. So, maybe here we should start a secondary fund, buy out LPs.
It's all about funds under management here.
Correct.
That's right.
Give me those
Gotta
management
get
fees. Until I can get that carry, that sweet carry.
That office is not going to pay for itself.
That's right, yeah. I wanted to also just ask a little bit on mistakes. So common mistakes you see founders and VCs make in M&A. This is obviously a big topic, but what are some of the most common ones you've seen recently?
The majority of mistakes that we see people make, it's tax. It's they've stuffed up the tax structuring.
Yeah, I think there's two. Certainly the more than 50 shareholders on the register and you're subject to Chapter 6 of the Corps Act. Probably rarer now. than it was.
Do you want to just explain what that is, just for some of the listeners that don't know what you're talking about?
Yeah, I can jump in if you like. So people might have heard of the takeover rules in the Corporations Act. So that's in Chapter 6 of the Corporations Act, specifies a number of very specific rules that apply to takeovers of companies to which that chapter applies. Now, the companies to which that chapter applies are any companies that are listed or unlisted with more than 50 shareholders. So people have heard of the 50 shareholder rule. There's a separate rule that says that if you got over 50 non-employee shareholders, you have to become a public company. And so people often think, oh, the rule is 50 non-employee holders. That does not work for the takeovers. So it's 50 hard, including employees. Otherwise, you're into the takeovers provisions. And what does that mean? It means that if you want to do an M&A deal to which the takeover provisions apply, a very specific and very regimented process that you have to comply. You basically have to make a take-home bid for the company. Or you have to go through a court-supervised process known as a scheme of arrangement that requires you to do various things like appear before the court, obtain an independent expert report, all of these, prepare a disclosure document. All of these things just add a lot of time and expense to the process. And so you do not want to be accidentally in that regime.
And a good lesson, as Toby said earlier, is, like obviously ESOP options where there's the O in the ESOP piece, right? Don't count towards your 50 hard limit. But if you stuff that up and you start issuing shares.
Exactly. And out of interest, what's the heritage of this? Because I don't think this applies in other jurisdictions where there's a lot of startup activity. But correct me if I'm wrong.
I think in the US, it's 200 and they've just lifted that to 1,000.
Yeah, which makes a lot more sense given that you have participation now from angel investors and people want to create wealth this way, right? Do you think Australia's going to go the same way?
I have not seen it raised anywhere.
Yeah, I think it would be a good idea to increase the threshold, but I don't think it is a priority on anyone's legislative agenda.
Yeah, great. Classic.
Yeah. I think just coming back to your question, it's more about, I think, setting up for success in the M&A process would be a better way to frame it, a more optimistic, positive way. Claire can probably run through sort of just setting yourself up generally from a DD and corporate perspective, but from a tax perspective on a transaction, on an M&A transaction, there's probably 3 major things to think about. The first is to the extent that the buyer is offering scrip, so shares in the buyer. If you've got different classes of shares, or even if you've got all the same shares, the way the tax rollover rules work is effectively you've got to meet a number of conditions in order for the tax to be deferred on the disposal of your shares. Otherwise, you're deemed to be taxed on the value of the shares that you receive in the buyer.
Gotcha.
There's the main issue for private companies is that the offer to all shareholders of the same class has to be on substantially the same terms. That can create problems where you've got investors with different expectations, particularly where you've got VCs on the cap table or other angel investors that either want to take cash and be cashed out, or the buyer doesn't necessarily want them along for the ride in the next stage. The deal can be structured as sort of a mix and match, and that all investors get the chance to choose what mix of cash and scrip in the buyer they would like. The buyer can put caps and collars around how much cash is available, how much scrip is available. The one thing that's really critical is that is a genuine offer from the buyer that's capable of acceptance by all shareholders. So while there may be sort of understandings and communications about, well, we expect that, Galileo will want to cash out, but the founders may want to continue having those. If those are sort of real pre-bid agreements as to what is going to be done, then you've got a problem in meeting that substantially the same terms requirement. And we've been through this with the ATO, and so it does need to be carefully documented also, but when there is a review, the ATO can ask for all forms of communication between the buyers and the sellers and between the sellers themselves. So Just because something's in WhatsApp or Slack does not mean the ATO will not have access to it. So it's just something to get advice on early and be really cognizant on. And it's sometimes an education piece for US buyers. Australian buyers hopefully will be a bit more aware that this is relevant, but it's sometimes a bit of a surprise.
Yeah.
So that's probably the first thing. The second point, employee equity. So the 2015 changes came through this concessional tax treatment for employees who'd been given options in startup concessional companies. One of the requirements, though, is that the employees cannot sell the options or shares within 3 years of the grant of the option, unless either they've ceased employment or there's a whole of company sale and the ATO agrees to waive that requirement. So that requires going to the ATO preferably in advance of the transaction, although we have been successful once in going afterwards to get the blessing sort of retrospectively. But it's just another thing to be aware of, that you need to get that through and ticked off. I consider unnecessary, and we lobbied against it during when the rules were first brought in, but that fell on deaf ears. And so there is also, if you've got unvested options, so typically on an exit, vested options will generally be cashed out, or they may be offered replacement options in the new entity that are fully vested. Unvested options usually just will be replaced with new options in the buyer. But again, there can be tax issues with that, and making sure that you line up, you get advice on that issue early is important to make sure you're not inadvertently creating tax issues for your employees. And then the last issue probably is more about earnouts, which are used. So there's a sort of fixed amount of consideration and then a variable amount depending on performance of the business going forward. There are ways of ensuring sort of a more tax favourable treatment of that, so you don't get taxed on the earnout component until you actually receive, if and when you receive cash. But again, it sort of just takes making sure that you've got advice on that and you're ticking all the boxes.
Moving on to the last question I wanted to ask about M&A. We talk a lot and we think a lot about the acquisition side of M&A, and we always think about the big company that buys the little company. And one of the things I think that founders often don't think about and don't even perhaps consider is the actual merger side, and there are some examples in Australian, recent-ish history of where we've seen mergers of, companies of a similar-ish size, and, there's still a determination as to which brand might end up being the parent in the end. But when founders are thinking about these kind of more merger situations than necessarily getting bought by, some bigger fish, what do you think the things are they should really be thinking about or considering as part of, sort of doing that dance, of determining what that outcome might look like?
I might take this one. Yeah, it's a really good question here. And I think you raised a really good point, which is not every M&A scenario is your big bang exit, right? And so step one is actually really thinking about, is this transaction an exit at all? Because the other thing that happens in those, what you've described as a merger scenario, is that usually it is scrip consideration.
And for those who don't know what scrip consideration is?
The shares or cash, basically, are the two types of consideration that we see most. And so the question is, who's going to be... So in Australia, you can't just do a genuine merger. There has to be one acquirer and one target. So you have to decide which of you is going to be the acquirer, which of you is going to be the target, and the acquirer will pay to the shareholders of the target in order to buy their shares. Bring the two companies together and away you go. So a couple of things you need to think about. One, you need to think about what's the merger ratio. So what are our relative valuations such that when we come together, whose shares roughly are the majority? You might be of equal size, you might be sort of 70-30. Generally, the larger company will be the acquirer, but that's not always the case. But a couple of complexities that are really relevant to VC-backed companies are, this is not just a simple ordinary share consideration. You might have a situation where both companies have already got a well-developed preference stack that has grown up separately, independently of each other, rounds have been done at different prices at different points in time and of different sizes. So trying to bring together two preference stacks is nigh on impossible. We're aware that it's been done, but it comes with all sorts of complexities that are, quite frankly, best avoided if you can. And so thinking about, okay, is this, for the target company, is this transaction an exit? Or how, or if not, what protection will investors expect going forwards? And likewise, for the buyer company, is it going to maintain its existing preference stack? Is it going to be issuing ordinary shares? Is it going to issue a new class of preference shares? And how will that work is a really key thing to think about right at the outset. It's something that you'll need tax advice on. You'll also need to come up with what the capital structure should look like going forward. And this is something that you really have to have a discussion on right at the preliminary stage, because it is complex and it's not something that you can leave until, the day before signing to work out.
Thanks, Claire. That's really interesting. Anything else to add?
Yeah, just one thing we have seen occasionally we do have an existing company acquiring another one where the existing company still meets the startup concessions, but the target is actually more than 10 years old. Just sort of looping back to the option plan or the startup concessional requirements for option plans to employees. One of the requirements is that no company in the group is more than 10 years old. And so that's just something that needs to be ticked off in advance so that you're aware that once you acquire that entity, that stops you being able to issue startup concessional options going forward. And just both parties need to be aware that's going to be the case.
Another good piece of advice. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, the other thing on just, developments, I guess, what we're seeing or what is interesting, particularly in light of the merger reforms we discussed earlier, was Microsoft's acqui-hire of the inflection as a way to get around, it would seem, potential antitrust concerns.
Yeah.
I will say I'm not a merger reform expert, but my understanding of having spoken to a couple of our merger partners is that sort of deal would still be caught by the new rules if you're otherwise within the thresholds.
Well, those kind of loopholes will get closed quite quickly if they start being used as loopholes, as many have suggested perhaps are the case.
Yeah, the AI Aquisitions, and the other one that's an interesting one that I know the regulators in the US are looking at when incumbent invests but owns IP rights and controls the company. So those like quasi-acquisitions as the
quasi-control.
Quasi-control investments, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Which again, I haven't seen any examples of in Australia, but I'm sure things will crop up as the tech sector here grows, just like in the US.
Yeah, Australia just loves to follow on the US just a little bit behind, right?
Yeah. Well, it would be a good problem to have, I guess, as far as the strength of the early stage ecosystem goes.
Correct. All right. Well, look, thanks very much, Claire and Toby, for joining us for our second section on M&A and some really good tips in there for our founders. Thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Our pleasure. Thanks, James. Thanks, you.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks, Toby.